no matter where you've come from, whether it be across the seas, across the state or across town. Once again, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal.
Last year, the Trust celebrated its 75th anniversary. And this inevitably led to reflection on our effectiveness in protecting the heritage of New South Wales. Today is the 50th anniversary of the first green bands at Kelly's Bush. The New South Wales Heritage Act should be at the core of the preservation of our heritage. It is the Act which helps to protect all that we hold so dear. So when the National Trust heard the Act was to be reviewed, we wanted to make sure that this would be a good thing, a strengthening of legislation, not a weakening. This event is designed so that we can help you understand what is proposed and what you can do about it. It's about helping the Standing Committee responsible for reviewing the Act to know exactly what the concerns of the community are and the potential impacts of the proposed changes. We have here today an incredible gathering of people passionate about our heritage. I want to thank the panellists who have volunteered their time and the supporting organisations who have helped us make this a truly representative community forum. In particular, I want to thank Australia ICOMOS, the Australasian Society for Historical Archaeology, the Australian Archaeology Association, Engineers Australia and Historic Houses Association. I hope that you all benefit from today's discussion as you prepare your own submissions. The National Trust will certainly be including your feedback in its submission.
In his introduction to the Heritage Awards last year, Minister Harwin said that the National Trust is in the unique position to champion the future of heritage management. And so with that in mind, we decided we needed this community forum today. As the National Trust, Australia's largest independent conservation charity, we wanted to hear from you, the community, as we wrote our own detailed response to this discussion paper. This event is for everyone. It was free and open to all. And you're welcome here, whether you're a concerned citizen, an owner of an old house, a heritage professional, or perhaps all three of the above. It's your act. We have some experts on our panels today, and I'd very much like to thank them all for their time. And they'll be able to give us some guidance to understand some of those aspects. But I'm sure all of them would agree that each person on each one of these tables also brings something to the discussion that we have to have today. So talking amongst your own table is a key takeaway for us from this event. We know you're all here because you're passionate and knowledgeable. I'm now going to introduce our Advocacy Manager, Jane Alexander, who's going to facilitate our first panel for us.
Thank you so much for coming here today. I'm delighted to see you all. And I was so pleased to see that we had so many non-National Trust members, because it means that you're starting a conversation with us maybe for the first time. So welcome. I hope you really enjoy this event. Our panel, Defend It Vigorously, is looking at the origins of the Heritage Act, how it's developed and changed over time, and what we can learn from that. So with me today is James Coleman. He was a member of the inaugural Heritage Council when it was first established. We also have Phil Jenkin, who's been a long-term community heritage advocate and was a recipient of a National Trust New South Wales Lifetime Achievement Award. We have Robert Power with us, who is the former manager of the Heritage Branch and former Principal Statutory Planning and Heritage Conservation. And Robert, you're going to have to pronounce this one for me. Advisian. And finally, we've got Sharon Veal, who is a CEO and partner at GML Heritage. Sharon actually sent a fantastic quote from Gough Whitlam in 1973 when he was talking about the concept of the national estate. And he noted that the Australian government has inherited a national estate which has been downgraded, disregarded and neglected, with all previous priorities accepted at various levels of government and authorities have been directed by a concept that uncontrolled development, economic growth and progress, an encouragement of private against public interest in land use and use of waters as indeed in every part of the National Estate, was paramount. And Sharon observes that it feels like we've come full circle back to that point again, and I think it was a really valid point. And Phil, you were around actively at that point back in the 60s and 70s.
I'm only 30 years of age, you realise.
Gosh, you're ageing well. So before the Heritage Act came in and before we had statutory legislation, there was a huge groundswell of movement to pressurise the government to actually enact better protections. What can we learn about?
Well, let's just go back to the green bans, because it is actually the 17th of June, just about a week's time, that the first green ban, it was then known as a black ban, but it became a green ban, was put down over Kelly's Bush in Hunters Hill. And the period before that had seen the establishment of trusts and preservation societies and groups, just a bit like today, in a sense, and they had been fighting to preserve the destruction of quite a lot of our heritage buildings and the proper protection of many of them as well. And that led eventually to 1971, when there was the green bans, the first green ban, and then it spread all over and of course went around the world. And it was led by a remarkable group of people, the Builders Labourers and Jack Mundy and others. And what they were doing basically was supporting community groups. Community group would say, this is worthwhile protecting, this building. They'd come out and they'd look at it and they'd agree or disagree, and then they would put a ban down over it. And what effect that had was enormous over people who were developers and government and everything else. And that's what it was like until Rand came in and actually put this legislation in, and similar legislation, and that was the start of a good news story that has been changed a little bit and corrupted ever since.
And Jim, you were part of having that new piece of legislation enacted, and you were on the inaugural Heritage Council. What was the role of the council when it first started, and how effective was it in supporting the objectives of the Act?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we were all pioneers. We didn't quite know what was down the track. We knew that there had been a lot of enthusiasm community-wide for the Act and for the establishment of the council. But as to what we were going to do and how we were going to do it, they were vague areas on the horizon. But I do recall we got great support from a group of people in the Department of what was then the State Planning Authority, I think. And maybe there are some in this room, but there was clear support within the bureaucracy for this whole concept. And I remember thinking at the time that the poor old National Trust was almost on the edge. They weren't in the middle. We had a National Trust representative on the council, but the Trust had no power. It was a very timid organisation, and I say that with great respect. It wasn't quite sure whether it should move into the big picture stuff of thinking about entire environments instead of the little church down on the corner. So it was a trigger for the Trust to start to take a more holistic view about heritage.
And Rob, you've seen the Act go through many amendments over time, and when it was first developed, the Act was going to be part of the planning legislation, and very, very, very last minute it got divorced from that and became its own standalone Act as we see it today. Do you think that that has been a useful thing for the Act, or do you think that it should have stayed within the land use planning system from the outset?
I've always been a very strong advocate for heritage conservation is an integral and undivisible part of environmental planning. And when you take it out of that context, then it is lost, in my view, because what we're talking about is the conservation of our environment in identified sites or buildings or structures or whatever they might be. Because in essence, what is important is that you get, and it's also linked to a fundamental point of environmental planning, which is land use. And so what we're talking about here are provisions which enable the items that have been identified as being of heritage significance for the conservation values that they have been assessed on. But it is important for them to remain viable, and it's important for them to be occupied and used. And unless there is a consideration of the heads of consideration in the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act to make sure that those things happen, together with the provisions in the planning instruments, for example, in relation to clause 5.10, and particularly subclause 10 of that clause, which provides for the adaptive reuse of buildings and sites and works which may otherwise be zoned not permissible. So the interrelationship and integration of heritage conservation into the planning system is absolutely essential to ensure the longevity of our heritage.
And I'll just encourage you all, the Q&A for this panel is open on the Slido app, so if you are thinking of questions, please start popping them into that app so that our moderator can see them coming through. And panellists as well, if you want to jump in at any point and add to something that somebody else has said, please do that. Sharon, the objectives of the Act haven't changed over time. They've stayed relatively stable. As a current practitioner and someone that's worked with the Act for quite a while, do you think those objectives, which form the entire vision of the Act as it is, do you think they are still relevant and useful objectives?
Thanks, Jane, and hi everyone, it's great to be here. Yeah, in essence, I mean, I think the fundamental driver of the Act is the conservation of the state's heritage. I think that is just as relevant today as it was when the Act was first legislated. I think the objectives really capture some of the key drivers of why we're all interested and connected and passionate about heritage. We really want heritage to be relevant, to have meaning and to have life in our communities. I think really thinking more deeply about Aboriginal heritage and better integration of that within the planning system and within the Heritage Act is a primary concern, I think. I think, going to the earlier points around land use planning and this notion of private interest and property vis-a-vis Aboriginal, our First Nations concepts of country and place and that indivisibility of their relationship to land and place. There's stuff that needs to be worked out. I mean, reading between the lines of this discussion paper, it looks like heritage is a problem for the state. And if you look at the State Heritage Register listings, of which there are around 1,700, 66% of that listed number are owned by government at state, local and Commonwealth level. Private companies own 33% and 6% of the total number of SHR listed items are owned by private individuals. So where's the problem exactly, would be my question.
And who is the review designed to assist?
Jane, could I just make a comment?
Of course.
I think it's also important for us to note that the assessment of what we are talking about in relation to the environment and how we assess it as we may have done at the time of the introduction of the EP&A Act and of the Heritage Act in 1977 was focused on land use and the understanding and the items that led to assessment of environment were really quite different to the scope of assessment of what the environment is today. There's been a fundamental shift, I think, in relation to the items that we now assess as for consideration. and the environment has a much greater, I think, a sociological emphasis than what it had before. And we're looking at a completely different range of items, and we had introduced into our considerations things like loss of connection with our place, which is solastalgia, which is a really quite an important, interesting, but very important item for us to consider, because what happens with solastalgia is that we lose the sense of connection with that which we had. So I think we're talking here also that there's a significant shift and difference in the matters that we are now assessing of being of environmental impacts.
And that's a really interesting point, because even though the Act has evolved over time, our understanding of what heritage is has evolved over time, but the Act hasn't necessarily captured that explicitly. It doesn't discount it, but it doesn't explicitly include it. And Jim, when you first started with the Heritage Council, and it very much was about earlier colonial buildings and streetscapes at that time, did you imagine a time where we'd be looking at things like intangible heritage, sitting in a brutalist building that's heritage listed?
Well, I think there were people, there were a lot of people at the time who had an understanding of intangible heritage values. People who had travelled and seen other parts of Australia, travelled the world, visited historic cities, they were aware subconsciously that there was something quite special at stake here. But the matters that came to the Heritage Council were typically individual buildings on an individual site, and that, I think, reflected the fact that I suppose the majority of trust members came from that framework. They were concerned about the little church down on the end of the street, or the future of a public building, but they didn't take a holistic view. The holistic view was starting to emerge, but we were still stuck with a statute that seemed to be preoccupied with a building on a site.
And the original intention, of course, of the Heritage Register was that it would evolve to become a representative list of all types of heritage. And when you look at the breakdown of what it lists, it's still not even getting close to that. I mean, Sharon, you work in consultancy, you'd see that list every day.
Yeah, well, certainly when you drill down and you do some searches of the item types on the State Heritage Register, there is a large number of buildings as opposed to different types of heritage listed for other reasons, whether they be aesthetic or social or spiritual. And I think I totally agree. I think we're in different times. Connections, the emotion, the spiritual values associated with places is causing a range of kind of concerns in how do we recognise, celebrate, commemorate those living cultural traditions and practices as part of our heritage. How do we celebrate and commemorate those values and activities in our daily life, but at the same time, how do we actually continue to protect and conserve our environment? And I totally agree with Rob. I mean, we look at the environmental crisis and the natural landscape and what we need to look forward to protecting into the future, and that is business critical.
And we did lose that connection with environment and place, and particularly with working with community groups over the years. I mean, Phil, you were heavily involved with the community groups, and for quite a while they've been operating on their own as lone voices, and sometimes not given the respect that's due to them from the expert professionals. How has the role of the community and the community groups with heritage protection changed during your time?
Well, can I say this? Conservation and conservation areas actually did start in the 1980s, because in Hunters Hill there was conservation. 2/3 of Hunters Hill are conservation areas, actually more than that. And conservation areas are really important because they gather up all the items of individual listings and actually conserve an area. And I'd love to see, for example, in country towns, which I think have got great collections of heritage, the conservation area concept is really critical, and it's the same in Sydney. I mean, Sydney is a collection of historic villages. If you look at Watson's Bay and Glebe and Hunters Hill and others, these places are significant as a place within a city. And so I'm a great supporter that government should be much more prepared, and the Heritage Office and New South Wales Heritage, whatever now, should be more prepared to actually look at places as significant and conserve them. It means that in land use planning, instead of coming along and saying we're going to rezone this and put up a 40-storey building, that area, has to be in keeping with the surrounding heritage items. And so I think that it's important that, and of course community groups, can I agree with what the President said? Everybody in this room and everybody in this state should be a member of the National Trust. And I say that advisedly. It's a body that actually fights for heritage, and it needs, overseas in England and so forth, you've got enormous number of people.
5 million.
5 million people belong. It's a thing that you would do automatically because you value heritage. Anybody who values heritage should join the National Trust and other environmental organisations. And what the Trust does well, there's out here, I can see them, there are groups that are formed, fighting in Parramatta, fighting for this and fighting for that. All great groups focused on that one issue. And that's hugely important because the Trust has got 1,000 issues it's fighting. But focusing on that issue and dealing with you and with David and others, fighting for the cause by a focus group. And the combination of a focus group fighting for heritage coupled with a organisation with wide community support is politically dynamite. It's really strong.
And we saw that recently in Victoria when the National Trust worked very closely with a residents' action group that formed to try and get Federation Square listed. So Federation Square was built in 2001, so it was quite a remarkable thing for it to be heritage listed, and the National Trust would feed expertise and support across to the residents' action group that could lobby much more heavily than was in the Trust remit, and it was a fantastically effective relationship, and they made some really great achievements.
Yeah, I think just adding to that, Jane, I think we saw community action with the Save Our Sirius group, who really were very politically and socially persuasive in terms of their campaign and used digital media to really mobilise and engage with the public in ways that were new and novel, including getting crowdsourced funding to end up in the Land and Environment Court and other ways and means that I think social media has really helped those campaigns. And Bill?
Yes, a point there that I'd like just come back to what Robert was saying about the advent of environmental assessment and the fact that we've got a much broader planning statutory threshold than we had in those early days. But there's still a perception that heritage is it's in a separate box. So as is landscape and civil engineering and gas and electricity and all the other things. So there's a series of boxes. What the Environmental Assessment Act, I think, was a bit of a dream, was that all these boxes would be melded together somehow and we'd get a holistic approach to major developments in particular. Now, I was working in New Zealand some years back in Christchurch. They've got a civic trust. They don't have a National Trust branch in Christchurch. They have a civic trust. It's a statute. It's a body which is set up under the law, and the City Council must refer matters to the Christchurch Civic Trust for an opinion. That doesn't happen here. There's no obligation on government to come and talk to David and the Trust. It's almost a voluntary thing. So there's a gap here which Sydney has never filled. Sydney's never had a comprehensive community-wide. We did have a coalition of resident action groups, but where's it gone? So we're still we're putting out bushfires, aren't we, here and there, but we haven't got a holistic position to take representing the metropolitan community of 7 million people.
Absolutely, and in the past, a lot of those organisations were able to nominate a member to the Heritage Council, and there were up to 5 organisations that could do that, and now there's only one, which is the National Trust, and on top of that, the Heritage Council doesn't have to be consulted on many things, such as state significant development. It's not mandated that they take on board the advice of the Heritage Council. And that was very different to when you were on the Heritage Council, and it had a much stronger ability to provide comment and have that acted on.
I think you're right, yes. And we also had the beginnings of movement in Canberra. There was a national message coming through from great leaders like Whitlam and Uren, and of course Jack Mundy. For some reason or other, these people they're somewhere up there now.
And that was another observation that people have been giving us, is that there is a lack of leadership from within government, from the Heritage Council, from areas where we used to expect it from, and a lack of expertise at times too, that is really contributing to heritage being seen as a detriment rather than a positive. What are all your thoughts on that?
Well, my thought on that is I think it's very obvious that the Heritage Council, as well-intentioned as it may be, but it has no face. It has no community presence. In fact, if you want to go looking for its annual reports are not just generally really easily available. You've got to go digging for them. And not only that, when you look at this, for example, the last report of 2019-2020, you have to go to 2 other departmental agencies' annual reports to get the data. So the Heritage Council, even as in its annual reporting processes, isn't reporting on all matters within its own report. The second thing about that is that the bureaucratisation of the support to the Heritage Council has meant that basically the Heritage Council has, as I've said, has no voice. And even the New South Wales Heritage itself, I don't believe that it has the presence that it ought to have.
And this is
and to reinforce the independence that the Heritage Council is supposed to operate under. Yeah. And that's a serious problem that we have.
Yeah, we've got a Heritage Council constituted by political appointments, and a lack of the diversity of expertise in heritage and its various moving parts around that table. I think too, we've seen broad-scale change within the New South Wales public sector with new capability frameworks and highly mobile, agile staff. With a strong brand of managerialism coming in, and a lot of outsourcing, which obviously in the industry is good for those of us working in the industry, but in terms of the consistency and the public good, a real diminution, I think, of the technical expertise within government.
And one of the discussion paper questions... One of the questions in the discussion paper for the review is how should the Heritage Council be put together? What should it represent? And it's an area that we're getting feedback saying that they want thoughts in what we think a Heritage Council should look like. Phil?
Yes, can I just say this, that the community, in fact, and there's community people here and disagree with me or not, but the community wants strong protections over our heritage. Not ones you can drive trucks through, frankly. They want strong protections. And that's not to say they don't want also adaptive reuse and all the things that make heritage work in practice, but they don't want it fiddled with and destroy the protections that are there. They actually want stronger protections. That's my view. And the view of the community is strong on this. It'll be painted that the community doesn't know, they're apathetic or whatever. They're not, they're strong. Anybody who's followed, like Mr Clark over there and others, who's followed the last year and a half about the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust, attempt by the state government to take over our significant headlands in Sydney Harbour and put them into the Sydney, Greater Sydney Parklands or something, there was a lengthy community consultation in that and a report that was written, a review, and people were expecting maybe we're going to lose that back to the state. Well, can I tell you, read the review. It says two things basically. The point that you were making is keep politics and party politics out of the trust boards and the organisations that run these things. Make them independent, genuinely and talented with the real skills that are needed, because they have been politicised. And I'm not talking about one party or another. Politicised. They shouldn't be politicised. And that was a submission that was accepted in that review from the community, accepted. The other thing that was accepted was an overwhelming view of the community that those headlands of national but state significance and so forth should not come back to the New South Wales government. And that was an overwhelming view that was taken. And the reason for that is, we all know, this kind of thing that's coming out now, where there is not sufficient, there's no trust of the community. Can I say this advisedly? There is no trust in the community in relation to the government over heritage and the environment.
I could add a case study in which I'm involved at the moment, and that's to do with the future of North Parramatta. If we're not careful, the next 2 or 3 decades will see a forest of high-rise towers, 30, 40 stories, marching up Church Street, right through to the jail, all through the provisions of changes to the local environmental plan, which are currently before government. Now, this is taking place in a locality where I think urban Australia was born. We tend to think that the Rocks was where it happened, but while the Rocks was being inhabited by Marines and soldiers and convicts, there were free settlers out at Parramatta. Some of the first land grants, the first farming on the banks of the river, and much of it in North Parramatta. There's several hundred local heritage items in North Parramatta. But when it comes to heritage, state government and the City Council see it in a reductionist way. A few little sites here, yeah, we'll keep them. But the overall ambience is going to be destroyed. So if you want to find out what's cooking in Parramatta, attend the council meeting tomorrow night.
And so is this where the current Act actually is letting us down and needs strengthening through this review in areas such as conservation areas and big picture management? Because we are seeing the government pick up ideas such as precinct planning, but they're based more on what available land a developer has been able to buy rather than the character of an available area. How do you think a Heritage Act could deal with that? Did it deal with it well in the past, or has this been going on since the beginning of the Act?
I'd just like my initial comment to that is, when the Heritage Act was first introduced, there were provisions for what were called conservation schemes, and they were powers that were given to the Heritage Council to prepare schemes for areas. Now, that was in the 1977 Act, and then in the 1979 amendment to the Heritage Act, following the introduction of the EP&A Act, and so that those conservation scheme provisions were in Part 5 of the Heritage Act, and they were revoked, and new provisions were put into Part 5, and those provisions provided for the Heritage Council, in consultation with the department and in consultation with the minister, to prepare planning instruments, environmental planning instruments, so that similar sort of power to what local government had, and indeed similar to powers that the Department of Planning had under Section 55 of the Act at that time. But those powers, and this I go back to my earlier point about the integration and integral components of heritage and environmental planning. This is an example of why that's so significant. But those powers were taken out of the Heritage Act, I think, around about 1998. So there was a very clear connection, intended legislative connection in environmental planning between heritage and local government planning. And that needs to be put back in.
And I'm just going to just check how our Q&A moderation is going, and if they're happy for us to keep talking, or if you've got questions coming in from the audience that you think should be thrown out to the panel. Well, yep, okay, because I could sit here and talk for hours, but I know that all of you will have some questions that you would like the panel to discuss. But so I was just about to say something then while we have Cameron coming up.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think this goes to a broader issue about strategic planning in New South Wales, and really, you know, we've seen local government underfunded in terms of its strategic planning and ability to get in front of development in various areas where pressure for growth has been, and that larger question of leadership that we talked about earlier about what is the vision for heritage in New South Wales? Where is our state strategy? What is the state's course and pattern of history, and what are those really important places that we need to protect and conserve for current and future generations?
Yes, I'll just add to that. If you want to have a vision, just pick up any piece of bureaucratic stuff that's coming out of the Department of Planning. We are thick with visions, but meanwhile, bricks are being laid. So the vision's there, there's all this lovely stuff, poetic, Shakespearean prose, but back at the ranch.
Absolutely.
Yes, they're big on vision, but they're very short on community, communication, consultation.
Well, Jane, there's been a wave of questions from the audience that we're having trouble keeping up with, but there are a few themes. There are a lot of questions in there, folks, lots of interesting questions. Thanks for putting them in. But there are a lot of questions in there that do speak directly to the design of a new Act or the reform of the Act, which is the explicit subject of the next panel. So if your question is around that, do be aware that there will be a whole panel dedicated to the ideal new Act.
Just stand close.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we were criticising you back there for not speaking close enough. So just saying that the questions about the design of the Act will be held over. I guess the themes coming through were a few. There are a few people concerned with the question of how the domain of expertise is being aligned with advocacy for a viewpoint and sidelined by government in recent times. I don't know if this is a question that any of you would like to speak to, having worked perhaps across as advocates and as professionals, how professionals themselves are at times being sidelined in the process for seemingly being partisans to heritage, for their expertise.
Oh gosh, the first thing that popped into my head when you were speaking then, Cameron, was I was driving to work this morning, and there was somebody talking about how the government has really led Australia into the strong position that it's in terms of COVID, and it's because they've listened to experts. And I think actually, and they've taken health advice, and I think actually that loss of expertise and independence in government is a real problem. And I think, yes, look, when you're working with government or for government, but also, you know, we all live in various communities, you can't help but sometimes get entangled in issues, and it's really, you know, you've got to have good processes in place to work out, you know, what you're going to do and where you're going to put your energy, and make sure that you're acting in the right interests and managing those interests in a way that's transparent and accountable. Absolutely. I mean, it's tricky.
Sure, and another theme within the questions is about how community groups can be empowered, I guess, and to what extent they're being frozen out, that it is a professionals' game that's essentially being worked out between proponents and government without meaningful input. So again, without speaking maybe specifically to how the Act should look, how does the panellists see that problem of the presence and I know a couple of you have spoken to this, the presence of the community in the process?
And I think one of the reasons it worked so well in the early days is, as some of the panellists pointed out earlier, there wasn't a heritage profession at that point. The heritage profession grew out of that, and there was then a disconnect between community and the new profession that was now going about their daily jobs. And I think that's come to our detriment, that we've lost the connection between the people that specialise in heritage and the people that are deeply passionate about protecting local areas on the ground.
You're also talking about the involvement, I think, of numbers of organisations on the Heritage Council originally, and they were representatives of the community. So the National Trust was on, a number of other people were on, and I think that's a great idea. The community actually feels support strongly being on these bodies because they can see things that experts perhaps can't see. They're too close to it. And they're also somewhat compromised. I mean, make no mistake, I've read lots of expert reports on behalf of developers wanting to do something totally inappropriate, where it's got down there on page 64, it's usually 64 or 66 or something like that, where it says on balance, it could be pretty awful really, but on balance, it's consistent with the heritage significance of the site. And you scratch yourself in various parts of your anatomy to work out how that could possibly have been said. So there is a need for the community to be involved at all levels and to be respected. The word respect is the word now, whether it's respect on harassment or respect on Aboriginal history or respect. There's not enough respect for heritage. And the fact is the community knows there's not, and it's up to all of us to make sure that we get a good result out of this battle.
Yes, I'll just say, coming back to Parramatta, I have read the reports of the City Council's Advisory Committee on Heritage. And if you go to the minutes of the Council's meetings, you'll see that the committee's points have been noted. End of story. Of course they've been noted, but acted upon? No. The Council's done its duty. It noted the report of the Heritage Committee.
And we're getting a lot of feedback back from our branches as well at the moment, and we've got about 12 to 15 local branches across the state, and more of those are coming back to us and telling us that the local Heritage Advisory Committee on their council has been disbanded. So the vast bulk of our branches now do not have a local Heritage Advisory Committee where they can feed information back to their council, and that's a huge issue given that, Sharon, you had some figures earlier, there's 1,700 places on the State Heritage Register, but there's more than 40,000 on the local environmental plans heritage schedules. So it represents the bulk of our heritage, and the community is getting cut out from having a voice to council.
I'll just make a point on that, Jane. What really concerns me about this review process is the diminishing of the significance of little L local heritage.
Exactly.
It is something that is of such importance because at the end of the day, all our heritage is local. Whether it ends up on a state heritage list or the national list or whether the World Heritage List, it's local because it has a base and it has a home in the local community. And heritage in a community sense is like music and art and sport. It's an international language. It enables us to communicate across divides and to bring understanding, and picking up the point about respect, and to respect each other's cultures wherever we may come from. So this proposal to grade heritage to exceptional significance, considerable significance, state significance or whatever is wrong, because it's actually addressing the wrong question. If something is of exceptional significance, it's of exceptional significance. Its exceptional significance lies in the values that have been identified as constituting its heritage significance. And all heritage items have values. That's why they're on lists.
Can I back that up? Because when you read the review, what it says is Opera House, Harbour Bridge, check, this is really important. We're going to strictly look after that from a heritage point of view. But landscapes, gee, that's a lot of land there. Maybe we could kind of do a bit of things like that on landscapes, so they want more flexibility. State heritage, oh no, we've got to have quick ways of streamlining it and doing this and doing that. And local, well, we're going to leave the local alone, just to let it rot there, because local's not important. Well, hello. Can I support what you say totally? Local is important. If it's Braidwood or wherever it is, in every country town almost, wonderful heritage lies there. It's important. You might think, well, that's just important for Braidwood. Is it? Is Hunters Hill important for those who live in Hunters Hill? They are guardians. They'll come and go. It's important to the nation. It is important. It's the oldest municipality in the nation, with the most heritage items per head of population in the nation, in one spot. Is that local? All our heritage there, except for 4 or 5, I think, is just there as local. It's not local. Everything that's local, in my view, is of state significance to be listed as local. But the government has just flogged it off. 40,000 there, don't bother about that. We're just concerned about the 1,700 or something. Not good enough.
Perhaps there's I'm conscious of the time, Jane, but perhaps we could finish that off with a larger political question that's been asked in here, which, given the relatively small number of owners involved in state heritage items, what are the interests, in a sense, that are driving the review? This is a question that's been asked in a few different ways.
It's a really good question, especially when the Minister had come out already saying that his priority as Minister for Heritage was to ensure that there was a standalone Indigenous Heritage Act that would adequately protect heritage places. And all of a sudden now the focus is on an existing act. And don't get me wrong, it might need some strengthening and some changes, but it seems ludicrous that when we still don't have an Indigenous Heritage Act, we're suddenly spending all our time tweaking the Historic Heritage Act, and combined with that, the makeup of ownership on that list really does make you question who is it that needs the streamlining process and who wants the easier approvals pathway.
Well, there are questions in there about the percentage of ownership of the state itself. So it does strike you that, given the government's primary policy objective often being enunciated around asset recycling, that they're really worried about their own assets. And there's certainly a question in there about, I took it more as a comment about the government having shifted from being protector to proponent of transformation of significant places. And it seems to me, I should be asking the questions here, not commenting, but it seems to me that the government's looking to free its own hands even more than it has, perhaps.
But the reality is that government has had to be dragged screaming to get items that are in its ownership on the State Heritage Register. Mm. It has not been a willing player in the process. And that has a long history, because way back, even in the early days of the, before the, say, 1945, when the Local Government Act was amended and Part 12A was inserted, to creating the power to create planning schemes, the County of Cumberland Council prepared lists of buildings which were to be recommended to the Minister for proclamation. And at that time, in the county scheme, there was a clause that provided that if an item was proclaimed, then ultimately the owner could require the government to purchase it. That's one point. The second point is that there was a clear decision made by government not to list items that are in government ownership. And that policy from the early 50s has been carried through all the way to where we are today. There are many, many significant places, like, for example, the Art Gallery of New South Wales up there in the Domain, that are not on the State Heritage Register. And they ought to be, and there's no reason why they could not be put on tomorrow, because we know what their values are. They don't have to go through a 40-page nomination process to be able to say that's significant. And that's one of the problems, is that the bureaucracy of assessing items to be on lists has become overblown.
So, Cameron, I think we've probably got about 1 or 2 minutes left.
Well, there is a fairly big theme within there, which I thought perhaps to bring up later or to return to after contribution, which is really about the relative strength or weakness in resourcing and staffing Heritage New South Wales. And some people have mentioned the Heritage Council. I think there's a bit of confusion or overlap there. Vis-a-vis the issue of reforming the Act, that is. And I think there's a discussion to be had there, but I wonder if perhaps we should just allow that one to percolate through the afternoon a little bit.
Yeah, it's certainly coming up in a lot of conversations. Is it the Act itself? Is it the application of the Act, or is it the resourcing of that application that is the issue? And I know the later panel today is going to delve quite deeply into that, and I'm sure the workshop section will as well. So we might just leave that one thinking.
Well, then the very last one, then if you have time for one more, then I guess there is a question of that's come up in the latter part of this, which is around the status of heritage conservation in the community in terms of its relative value as a priority for government, I guess, versus questions that people might see in competition with it. For example, housing justice or other questions that people sometimes put as a competing priority. I suppose, do any of the panellists see that? It's something that's clearly changed a lot in the time since the Act was implemented, the perception around that there are other planning or just priorities, if you like, that aren't aligned necessarily with heritage conservation. So I guess, is there a reputational issue for heritage?
Oh, just a quick response there. The connection between social housing and heritage is worth raising in lots of different forums. People don't automatically make that link, but it's one of the aspects of rejuvenation of heritage sites, heritage buildings, to suggest that disadvantaged people might be able to use a heritage building to their advantage and at no cost to society is something. It's a question that needs to be kicked around. I think it's part of the adaptive reuse concept.
Heritage obviously means different things to different people. I think for the state government, it's become increasingly contested and difficult for them to wrap their head around this expanding definition of heritage. For First Nations people, obviously, they're not getting the outcomes in terms of conservation and respect and recognition of their rights and interests in heritage as part of the bigger macro planning. I think certainly the state government sees heritage as a problem, and it wants to be able to liberate its assets to deliver to the bottom line. And we know with this Liberal government, economic development and customer centricity is really what they're gearing towards. I heard Gladys speak a few weeks ago, and she's really got her heart set on Sydney becoming the capital of the Asia Pacific region. So, that really strong drive for economic development and the ability to allow proponents to kind of, the private sector to deliver what the government is unable to deliver is really near and present.
Should we leave it there? Perhaps you can explain to us later too who the customers are for heritage. I was a bit confused. I was a bit confused by that reference in the terms of reference.
Weren't we all? All right, so that's the end of our first panel. Thank you so much to our panellists for coming along today and giving